Just before this year's National Football League draft, one of the sports writers in Philadelphia wrote an article describing how in 1983 during the draft, when the Philadelphia Eagles went to make their selection, Dan Marino, the Hall of Fame quarterback, was available, and the Eagles didn't pick him. 2 years later in 1985, when it came time for the Eagles to pick, Jerry Rice, the Hall of Fame wide receiver, was available, and they didn't pick him either. So the writer pointed out that the Eagles could have had Dan Marino throwing the ball to Jerry Rice. As an Eagles fan, it was painful to even read those words. Why? Because of the gap between what could have been and what was. And that's really what Sefirat Omer is all about. The 50 days that we're counting now in between Passover, Pesach, when God freed us from slavery in Egypt, and Shavuot, when we stood at the base of Mount Sinai and received the Torah. We count each one of those days to remind ourselves that every time we waste a day spiritually, we widen the gap between who we can be and who we are. But every day that we use productively in our service of God, we narrow that gap. One of the commentators explains that liberty without law is a doubtful boon to men or nations. But there's a difference between countries and people. Political freedom can be received passively as a gift from God. But moral freedom requires hard work, intensive work over the course of these 50 days as we prepare ourselves to receive the Torah. Moral freedom can only be gained through a commitment and a follow-through, a commitment to observe God's laws. The rabbis say that after death, when we get up to heaven, God says, let's go to the videotape. And each of us is shown a movie. In that movie, we see what we could have been had we reached our full spiritual potential. The greater the gap between what we look like in that movie and what we looked like down here on earth, the more painful it is to watch the movie. That's hell. The commentators explain that when Avraham was about to slaughter his son in compliance with God's command, and the angel of God called out to him, Avraham, Avraham, repeating his name twice, that signified that the earthly Avraham, the Avraham down here, had met the heavenly Avraham, the one up there. Avraham had reached his full spiritual potential. There's a famous story told about the great sage, the Netziv. When he was young, he wasn't doing particularly well in his studies in yeshiva. One night before going to sleep, he overheard his parents talking about how they were going to give up on those studies and instead send him out to be an apprentice to a shoemaker. He had a dream that night, and in his dream he was up in heaven after death. And they were asking him, what happened to that book and that sefer? And he said, what are you talking about? I was a shoemaker. And they said, what do you mean? You were supposed to be the Netziv. You were supposed to write the Emek Davar and all of these other phenomenal works of scholarship, some of the greatest works in Jewish history. What happened? The next morning he woke up. He convinced his parents that he'd apply himself more to his studies if they'd give him another chance. They agreed, and he grew up to become the Netziv, and he wrote all of those great works. Don't ever give up on yourself, particularly during these days. Make every day count.